Good evening. My name is Roland Ramsaran, and I'm the Academic Dean of the Seminary. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the 2023 Hayden Lectureships in Historical Theology in the historic Mildred Welshamer Phillips Memorial Chapel at Emmanuel Christian Seminary. This evening we welcome our lecturer, Dr. Jennifer Newsome Martin from the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. And thanks to all of you who have joined us tonight and those of you that are joining us via live stream. We are grateful to all of those at Emmanuel Christian Seminary and Milligan who have worked to bring this lectureship to fruition throughout the day today. It's been a great time, and we're enjoying it muchly. Especially I'd like to thank Dr. Miriam Perkins and Dr. David Kiger, who have guided the lectureship committee superbly this academic year. We're grateful for that. And we are most grateful to Dan and Linda Lawson, whose generous funding supports the Hayden Lectureship on a biennial basis. Dan and Linda continue to be long-term friends and supporters of Emmanuel and have joined us here tonight. Thank you. We thank them for their continued kindness and support and generosity. The Hayden Lectureships celebrate and honor the life of Linda Lawson's father, Edwin V. Hayden. Edwin Hayden was a minister in Christian churches, Churches of Christ congregations, an editor of the Christian Standard, an author of numerous articles and books, and an educator both in the States and abroad. He was the first recipient of Emmanuel's prestigious James A. Garfield Award for service to the church. Edwin Hayden was a remarkable individual and a faithful servant of Christ, and we seek to honor him with this lectureship today. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jennifer Newsome Martin. Dr. Martin is a Catholic systematic theologian with particular expertise in the thought of Hans Urs von Balthasar. She is an award-winning teacher and scholar, as has been shared in earlier introductions, and there is more information in your printed programs that you can look at as well. Now, Dr. Martin is my hero, as I think she is probably the hero of all New Testament scholars. She has brought an insightful set of lectures structured around verses from chapter 13 of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, faith, hope, and love. And the intertextual echoes to the New Testament apocryphal work of the Apocalypse of Peter in Dante's Inferno is just a cool plus along the way. A verse that keeps coming to my mind is Galatians 4:9. Now that you have come to know God, or rather, to be known by God. I feel like I've been tutored about that today. On the art of seeing, theological aesthetics for the church, we have learned to read with Balthasar, beauty is the first thing. It has an impact. Faith provides a stance, an openness to beauty. Beauty adds to our character and our ethics, and beauty brings contact with God. Yet we have unfulfilled longings for beauty to last, to continue. Even that points to a hope in a final longing for all things to be rightly related to God. Faith and hope. But what's love got to do with it? And what about the cross? I'm not going to sing, so. Thought about it. My wife gave me good advice. All right. And what about the cross of Jesus and its shape? Dr. Martin brings a fine personality, a warm smile, and an engaging intellect to this set of lectures. We now welcome her again for the third and final lecture, Beauty and the Cross. Cruciform love alone is credible. Welcome, Dr. Martin.
Good evening, my friends. I said when we first got here, it feels like a million years ago, doesn't it, this morning, that this was a bit of a homecoming, but the more I chat with you all, the more I realize like how much our lives have intersected, right? I've just talked to the Shades, who know my in-laws very well, and my sister used to date John Lawson, I just discovered. So we have a lot of connections, and I'm really, truly grateful for you all for sticking with me all day. I know we've done a lot of theology all day together, and I appreciate you being here. So a warm welcome to those of you who are just joining us, and also to those of you who've been here since this morning. So thank you so much for your steadfastness and your interest in these 3 lectures. So the verse that we've been thinking through together in a sort of gestural way. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these 3, and the greatest of these is love. So a warm welcome to the 3rd and final lecture of the Hayden Lectureship for 2023, entitled Beauty and the Cross, Cruciform Love Alone is Credible. As you recall, our 3 lectures have been held together thematically, not only by this sort of global exploration of the theme of theological aesthetics, but also by the 3 theological virtues, as introduction has so elegantly already expressed: faith, hope, and love. This morning's lecture was a consideration of faith, especially insofar as it animates a contemplative spiritual reading of both the Christian scriptures as well as Christian history. The afternoon's lecture was given over to the virtue of hope, as we considered the intersection of the experience of beauty and eschatological desire for perfect union with God in the beatific vision, alongside insights from Dante's Divine Comedy. This evening's lecture opens out upon those infinite vistas of love, which is, as 1 Corinthians says, in no uncertain terms, the greatest of these. The Catechism of the Catholic Church describes love or charity as, quote, the theological virtue by which we love God above all things for his sake, and our neighbor as ourselves for the love of God. It is this theological virtue of love, infused supernaturally into the human soul by God, that upholds and purifies our human ability to love and raises it to the supernatural perfection of divine love. It's like Augustine said, the love we love our brother with, we know more intimately than our brother, right? Because it's God who capacitates our love to love our brother. So all of my new Balthasarian friends out there will already know that the subtitle of this 3rd lecture has been taken from his marvelous little book, Love Alone is Credible. If you're interested in a good kind of gateway drug to Balthasar, this is it. Love Alone is Credible is short, it's zippy, it communicates his kind of aesthetic program without all of the literary throat clearing. It's not 400 pages, it's less than 100, I think. So it was really meant to serve as a summative introduction to his broad project of theological aesthetics, which, as we already said this morning, was elaborated at much kind of agonizingly long length in all of the volumes of The Glory of the Lord. So in the first 2 chapters of this book, Love Alone is Credible, and in much of Glory of the Lord 1, Balthasar offers something, he offers a sort of narrative of lament. He says, how have things gone so wrong with beauty, right? How have we lost it? So he tells the story of how beauty has been relegated to something just subjective, just superficial. How was the cosmos that was in ancient and biblical and medieval times thought to be so luminous with mystery and meaning and divinity, how has it become naturalized and desacralized and demythologized? He laments how a divided church after the Reformation has damaged the credibility of Christianity. He laments how, in modernity, the human being has displaced God as the center of the world and begins to set the terms for it. He laments about the rise of empiricism and rationalism. We were just having a dinner with the students. We were talking about how to communicate these kinds of things in a world where everything that is measurable is the only thing that is real, things that are empirical, things that are scientific. Like, how do we deal with this pastorally? And this is a lot of the things that Balthasar is talking about in this book. So all of these factors in his account conspire together to give us this sort of purely ethical or naturalized religion, as well as the sense that human beings simply have no access to the invisible realm beyond the observable scientific universe, right? What is the really real? I mean, for Plato thinks the really real is the forms, right, where the gods live. And here we think the really real is something we can reproduce in a laboratory, right? So it's a very different understanding of what is real. So in the modern age, if something were to count as real, it meant it has to be subject to strict laws of empirical verification. Or it's related first and defined by the human subject. He calls this, in this book, the anthropological reduction. Things are real because we say they're real. And so in the wake of these twin contractions of the religious imagination, Balthasar argues it's only the personal and aesthetic revelation of God's love which can escape the pull of this empirical or anthropological verificationism. It's love. What's love got to do with it? Everything, right? This aesthetic, again, that Balthasar is recovering isn't philosophical at root. It's not artistic at root, but is at bottom a theological category. So as we've been talking today, what we're talking about here is the beauty in Christian revelation, beauty as expressed in the glory of revelation in the theophanies of the Hebrew Bible, in the incarnation of the Son of God as Jesus Christ. This is something which exceeds by an order of magnitude simply philosophical aesthetics. It has to be properly theological. And for Balthasar, that is, quote, the reception perceived with the eyes of faith of the self-interpreting glory of the sovereignly free love of God. Balthasar understands this content of the sovereignly free love of God as expressed with perfect coherence in the revelation of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, in which, quote, the Logos expresses himself as love, agape, and thus as glory. The genuine encounter with the beauty of the Logos, with the beauty of Christ, contains its own self-evidence in a way that is not reducible to propositions or empirical verification. Right? So that's what the aesthetic can bring. A theological aesthetic brings its own evidentiary power in a way that resists empirical proof. So we've been talking a lot about Balthasar. I'm going to add another interlocutor to the mix, another couple of interlocutors, inviting the insights of another systematic theologian who was extraordinarily influenced by Balthasar's theology, and that is Joseph Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI, who recently died on the last day of the year, on December 31st, 2022, so very recently. Alongside Balthasar, and this gets to some of the questions we've been talking about a bit in the Q&A, Ratzinger really draws out with force the idea that the cross and the cruciform vision of Christ represents an important complication of theological aesthetics. So whereas classical and medieval aesthetics vaunted such ideals as proportion, harmony, wholeness, integrity, the cross of Christ introduces more hidden ways of encountering the splendor of the beautiful. In Ratzinger, as in Balthasar, beauty never appears in an exclusively aestheticized register, but is always calibrated theologically in Christ, who we know from Colossians is the image or icon of the invisible God. As someone pointed out, I think in the questions earlier, someone who lived through 2 world wars and witnessed an absolute parade of atrocities of the 20th and 21st century, Benedict knew well that a purely harmonious concept of beauty is not enough. It cannot stand up to the confrontation with the gravity of the questioning about God, truth, and beauty. Ratzinger goes on to say, whoever believes in God, in the God who manifested himself precisely in the altered appearance of Christ crucified as love to the end, knows that beauty is truth and truth beauty. But in the suffering Christ, he also learns that the beauty of truth also embraces offense, pain, and even the dark mystery of death, and that this can only be found in accepting suffering, not ignoring it. Right? So there may be a temptation to think with an aesthetic worldview that that beauty can kind of like be a salve, a Band-Aid on top of suffering. And here we're getting this broader picture of aesthetics where it's only through accepting the suffering and not ignoring it. So here I'm going to consider Ratzinger in sort of as a starting off point with more classical aesthetics. Thomas Aquinas is doing something very different than Ratzinger, but I did want this to be our starting point for comparison. So in question 39 of the Summa Theologica, Aquinas says that the three fundamental conditions of beauty are these: integritas, wholeness or perfection; consonantia, proportionality or harmony; and claritas, radiance, luminosity, clarity, brightness. So two things are important for us to recognize here as we're thinking about this question of the Summa. First, Thomas is not writing an independent treatise on aesthetics. He's talking about the Trinity. This is a question on the persons of the Trinity. He is asking the question, here we're going to get in the Trinitarian weeds for 30 seconds, but it won't last long. He's asking the question about how the hypostatic relations, that is the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, relate to divine substance. So he's asking the question in Article 8, whether or not the traditional manner in which these essential attributes are appropriated to each of the personal relations is fitting. Okay, so like the way that we talk about the persons of the Trinity, is it fitting that we use the language that we do? So in the tradition, and for Aquinas, the Son, the second person of the Trinity, is associated with beauty. And he says, yes, this is appropriate. This is fitting, because as the second person of the Trinity, we can apply these sort of three aesthetic concepts to the second person of the Trinity. He says wholeness fits, perfection fits, because the Son is wholly and truly of the same nature as the Father. So there's a sort of perfect expression. The same is true for proportionality. Right? The Son is the Father's perfect representative image. Think this is the Gospel of John, right? He who has seen the Father has seen me, or he who has seen me has seen the Father, right? There's a proportion there. And then finally, radiance, because the Son, as the Logos, or this principle of intelligibility, illumines our intellects from within. So, I think it's important that Aquinas, we understand the context in which he's talking about these things. So it's the context of Trinitarian relations, and more specifically, Christological kind of idea. But what's also interesting to me is if you look at question 39 of the Summa Theologica, Aquinas is quoting Augustine left and right. So he's quoting from Augustine's De Trinitate. And if you've read much of Augustine and you've read much of Aquinas, you know in terms of theological style that they're extraordinarily different, right? I think it's important that Aquinas appeals so heavily to Augustine here is an invitation to us, if not an absolute injunction, to draw out Ratzinger's own privileging of Augustine over Thomas. Now, Ratzinger loved Augustine. He wrote his second dissertation. That's the thing, second dissertations for those German scholars, right? He wrote his second dissertation on Augustine, and he sort of styled himself as an Augustinian. So, though Aquinas does quote very prodigiously from De Trinitate, Augustine's book on the Trinity, in this question, he does not replicate Augustine in terms of style. Aquinas he maintains a scholastic approach for very good reason. It's very measured, it's very ordered. And if you read Augustine's De Trinitate, it is a marvelously rambling, jumbled, polyphonic catalog of spectacular failure of images and analogs. He says, is the Trinity like this? Kinda. No, that didn't work. Let's try something else. And it just goes on and on in that respect. So it is, I think it is a deliberate failure because what Augustine does at the end of that book is he prays that God will transfigure him entirely, right? He says that intellectual discourse isn't going to do it. So he says, what does he say? Remember me, love me, until you transform these things in me entirely, or something like that. So it's a kind of final prayer for transformation, a prayer that human beings might be refigured or repatterned according to its divine prototype. So what I want to argue is that in his return to Augustine and the Platonic aesthetic tradition, we remember our sort of death march through that this afternoon. We started with Plotinus and Plato and Plotinus, and we kind of went forward thinking about this as the sort of Augustinian and Platonic aesthetic tradition. Ratzinger does not, I don't think, subvert entirely, but rather aspirates this more propositional nature of Thomistic aesthetics and complicates sometimes kind of inverts some of these conventional understandings of wholeness, proportion, and radiance. So we're going to talk a little bit about how he does that. Okay. I mentioned earlier today Ratzinger's 2002 address, The Feeling of Things, the Contemplation of Beauty. That's the one where he mentions the Phaedrus. And here you get a real ratification of why Ratzinger loves Augustine so much. So in this address, Ratzinger points out a really interesting paradox, a really interesting juxtaposition, liturgical juxtaposition. So he says, when you have these antiphons that are being read, when it's introducing Psalm 44, and the Monday of the second week of the Psalter, there's one during Lent, and there's one during the Holy Week. So during Lent, the antiphon during the prayer, which is said, is from Psalm 45:2. And that psalm says, "You are the most handsome of men. Grace is poured upon your lips. Therefore God has blessed you forever. You are the most handsome of men." That's what you need to know. But then, during Holy Week, the antiphon for the same psalm is from Isaiah 53. "He hath no form or majesty that we should look on him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him." Right? So this sort of paradox at the heart of this liturgical, one of those things for the very same psalm says, "You are the most handsome of men," and the other one says, "He hath no form or majesty that we should desire him." So which is it? Right? Is it both? How do we sort of deal with this apparent tension in these Vespers prayers? So on the one hand, we have this superlative beauty, this lavish outpouring of grace, and on the other hand, we have the stark absence of beauty and grace to such a degree that it even provokes repulsion. This tension is really palpable. So as Ratzinger goes on in this text, he's talking about Augustine, and he says that Augustine here had a keen appreciation of his paradox and realized that in this regard, the great Greek philosophy of the beautiful was not simply rejected, but rather dramatically called into question what the beautiful might be, what beauty might mean. Referring to the paradox contained in these texts, he spoke of the contrasting blasts of two trumpets, produced by the same breath, the same spirit. He knew that a paradox is contrast and not contradiction. Both quotes come from the same Spirit who inspires all Scripture, but sounds different notes in it. It is in this way that he sets us before the totality of true beauty of truth itself. So here's our framework. We have this paradox that we're starting with. Is Christ beautiful? Is the crucifixion beautiful? So this evening, I am taking my sort of primary cue from Ratzinger's gloss of Augustine here. I want us to ask the question together, what beauty might mean in light of the cross. So tonight I'll suggest that the cruciform concept of beauty that I think I will suggest later are informed by Ratzinger's own Holy Week meditations that he wrote in 1967, allows for the possibility of the full gamut of revelatory disclosures of God. Things we've talked about a little bit today, earlier. Can we think about beauty in hiddenness, or silence, or interruption, or contradiction, or formlessness, or pain, or the mystery of death, or poverty, vulnerability, woundedness, suffering, right? Can we think of beauty some way as connected with loss and grief, or this commingling of light and dark, this commingling of joy and grief? So what we'll suggest is that what emerges as most important isn't that Greek aesthetic. It's not those Greek aesthetic ideals of proportion or harmony, but rather that luminousness and poverty of the love which shines through the broken face and body of Jesus Christ. So, here we have Ratzinger, a young Ratzinger, a dashing young Ratzinger. Apparently he was a bit of a chain smoker and also loved cats, so I think there's pictures of him smoking with his cats. But here's a picture of him from a long time ago. The guy in the upper right is a painter, an American expressionist painter called William Congdon, and the bottom little bit is from a book cover, a book that was published called The Sabbath of History, where someone basically put Ratzinger's Holy Week meditations with these paintings by this American abstract artist, William Congdon. So that's going to be our text of the evening. We're going to be thinking about this, what's called an involuntary dialogue, because Congdon and Ratzinger didn't do this, someone else put these together. But there's something about the Holy Week meditations that Ratzinger wrote and these particular paintings that William Congdon made in this book called A Sabbath of History. So let's turn sort of briefly now to the text of some of those Holy Week meditations, and then we'll look at some of William Congdon's visual images that accompany them. I think it's important to say, too, we have been sort of thinking together about a lot of visual art and poetic art, and I think it's important to say that the meditations themselves, I think, apart from the art, have aesthetic significance, because the text has an aesthetic texture independent of its juxtaposition with those paintings. In these meditations, Ratzinger employs very painterly vocabulary. He talks about chiaroscuro, right? You know this maybe from art history. If you know Caravaggio's paintings, which have a lot of interplay between light and dark, this kind of strong contrast between light and dark in one composition. So Ratzinger talks about this. He was born way back he was born on a Holy Saturday in 1927, and he wrote that, quote, "Life from its beginning seemed oriented to a strange chiaroscuro of pain and hope, of divine hiddenness and presence," right? Coming into the world on a Holy Saturday, witnessing all the things that he witnessed. You can see those juxtapositions of the sort of inarticulable grief of Good Friday and the sense of devastation on Holy Saturday, and then the unexpected yet all-surpassing joy of the Easter miracle. So Ratzinger talks a lot about the Holy Week liturgy, but also his own life as living in this tension of brightness and darkness. He says this is the tension, this brightness-darkness tension marks all of Christian existence. That recalls, I think, Augustine's interpretation of those liturgically juxtaposed scriptural passages of beauty and wretchedness as those two distinct trumpets that call or proceed from the same breath of the Holy Spirit. So for Ratzinger, this man who came into the world in that fragile interlude space of a Holy Saturday, it's no surprise that his writings mark the day's deep theological and existential significance and even ambivalence. Ratzinger says the 20th century was a long Holy Saturday, the whole century. He says in this century, it is this century that marks the day that expresses the unparalleled experience of our age, anticipating the fact that God is simply absent, that the grave hides him, that he is no longer awakes, no longer speaks. In a certain sense, Holy Saturday might then become the ultimate legitimation of aesthetic formlessness. I am going to show you some paintings which seem to challenge the notion of Balthasar on the form, which we've been thinking about today. So here we're looking at the other side. But it's important to say what these paintings are doing is not a kind of nihilistic formlessness or sort of pure banality. It's not that. It is, for Ratzinger and Balthasar, this kind of kenotic outpouring of Christ is the glory, right? I mean, we talked a bit about God's divinity appearing in these hidden forms of the cross, and we talked about the theophanies as well, but this isn't, for Balthasar, the absence of revelation, but is the very form and the disclosure of Trinitarian and Christological love, like we've been discussing. So, as we're saying, Balthasar's theological aesthetics, though it's best known for its articulation and defense of the integrity of form, the existence of the cross of Christ widens how this form can appear aesthetically. So, I want to explore this idea by suggesting that Balthasar's aesthetic can and ought to be widened to include post-representational, non-figural, abstract art. I can feel your heart sinking. Abstract art, what? But I think we can sort of think about it together. But let me be the first to admit, abstract art poses a unique interpretive challenge. We think about representative art, like classical examples of the Mona Lisa, Bernini's David. I mean, I got to see that in real life in Rome a few years ago, and it is amazing that you can do such things with marble. But they can be so realistic. It allows us to forget, if but for a moment, the material or formal content in preference to the representative or symbolic content. So what I mean is, when you look at the Mona Lisa, the first thing you see isn't paint. You see an enigmatically smiling woman. Is she sad? Is she happy? Who knows? Who can say? Is this painting even any good? I don't know. So I'm not actually sure of that. I'm not sure that's actually, anyway, that's beside the point. When you look at the David, you don't first see, oh, this is marble. You see, oh, this is one of the Bible's great heroes. So that's not the case with abstract art, right? You look at abstract art, and here the artist is interested mostly in the production of pure phenomena, like shape, line, color, composition, even the texture and the density of the physical materials. You can see this is a little bit of a detail from Jackson Pollock's Full Fathom 5, which is very textured, right? I mean, he's got like keys and cigarette butts and other things just sort of like in there. I mean, it's very textured. So if these abstract artists aren't concerned with symbolic representation, their foregrounding elements, as I said, like tone, vibrancy, color, line, graphic forms, the picture plane, and these physical materials are brought very near to the surface. You can see the brushstrokes, you can see the smudges, you can see the paint. They're meant to be noticed. They're meant not to be sort of seen through to the so-called real content or the subject of the painting, what it purports to represent, right? I mean, we all know this Magritte's This Is Not a Pipe, you know, that painting, which is a picture of a pipe, but it says this is not a pipe in French underneath, right? Because it's not a pipe, it's canvas, it's paint, right? So abstract artists are making us sort of remember what we're looking at in terms of the physical world, the physical paint itself. So, I mean, I know this is not to everyone's taste. It's not even quite to mine. But I think an appeal to abstract art might have some theological and maybe even some pastoral payoff. I know you don't believe me yet, but let's try this on for size and see what we think. All right. So first I wonder, now this is all in the interrogative mode. I'm saying this in an interrogative sort of way. I wonder if we might approach abstract art with the idea that it might be especially good for cultivating in those who patiently view it the virtue and the practice of empathy. To pause before a work of non-figural, non-representational art presses upon the perceiver the aesthetic and I would say even ethical responsibility not to dismiss it as simplistic or impenetrable nonsense, which is my impulse, but rather to attend to it with care as a phenomenon expressive of at least the artist's intent. Right? How can we look upon the work, not only with a hermeneutic of charity, but even, as Balthazar puts it elsewhere, through the eyes of loving comprehension, to see something true of the artist who made it. And then I think, how else does any phenomenon, anything, any human person especially, appear in our field of vision besides as a phenomenon of inscrutable mystery, who could just as easily be dismissed or caricatured because we think we know all there is to know about that person. Here I think there can be a clear link between personalist aesthetics and personalist ethics. What gets encountered in non-representational art presents itself to the gaze of the perceiver. It gives itself over as it appears, creating an obligation and responsibility in the one who sees it to look upon it with understanding, patience, and empathy. And I think another feature of such art, I ask, interrogatively, is that it disrupts our penchant and need for conceptual mastery. According to our new friend, Balthazar, being itself, everything, is marked by mystery as a permanent, persistent phenomenon, even in the most mundane manifestations of being in the world. He says, the gratuity and grace of these ordinary expressions is, quote, a daily renewed, perennial, inexhaustible wonder. And I think that's really lovely. One of my Facebook friends just posted a picture of her little grandchild holding an orange and looking at it like, what is this? Touching it, feeling, and so like
that to me is the posture. That's what I'm after right here, this idea that anything at all, once we start thinking of things as ordinary, we take them for granted, right? But think about how wonderful it is that such things as oranges exist, right? That you can touch them and smell them and taste them. What a miracle. I mean, Basil of Caesarea in his homilies on the created world says, oh, what a marvelous thing is bark. Oh, there's so many different kinds of bark. What a marvelous thing. And you can imagine him moving through the world, touching all the bark, the smooth bark of or the variegated bark of a birch, and thinking, how is this even possible that we live in a place with these miracles? Right? That's what I'm after. So, as Balthasar says, a daily renewed, perennially inexhaustible wonder. That anything at all should exist and give itself to human perception is astonishing. So we might look at everything, every blade of grass or cicada or pebble or beetle or man or woman, as if awaiting some mysterious disclosure. Encountering works of art, particularly these post-representational ones, distills this experience into concentrated form, encouraging a receptive vision that awaits further and further disclosures of their inner mystery and chastening the closures of conceptual mastery. Every phenomenon, particularly these kinds of works of art, signify a more that resists full analysis or closure. I know this is a hard sell, but the third thing that I might suggest is there may be some wisdom in what Balthasar says of the hiddenness of God, who, as we've already said, reveals his divinity under these counterforms, antiforms. God in the burning bush, the pillars of cloud and smoke, the agony of the cross, Jesus' own sense of abandonment by the Father. But as we've already said for Balthasar, as for Ratzinger, the hiddenness and silence of Holy Saturday is not the absence of revelation, but its very form. So these sites of darkness, which might otherwise be excluded from classical aesthetic considerations, are rather for Balthasar and Ratzinger indications of divine glory and of love, the only thing that is credible. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about Ratzinger's Christology, and then we're going to look at some art. Okay, so Ratzinger meditates on the sonship of the second person of the Trinity, the Son, the Logos, who became incarnate as Jesus Christ. I think this is a long text, but I think he draws out really beautifully some things, insights from the Gospel of John, and John's commitment to depicting the relation of the Father and the Son, which is found in those statements, like the Father and I are one, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. The being of Jesus as the incarnation of the eternal Son is thus the fullest actualization of genuine human personhood. This is Ratzinger here. His idea is his personhood is perfectly relational, received, and ecstatic. That is, it's marked entirely by openness, right? If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. I'm open to the Father. I'm open to the gathered community. And if we take this as the model of personhood, which is not the model of personhood we kind of inherit, we think of personhood as the sort of monadic ego, I do what I want, I have my rights. But this is another vision of what being a person might be. So I'm going to read a long bit from his Introduction to Christianity, which is a text that used those 1967 Holy Week meditations as their basis. So he says, the Son does not proceed in any way from himself, and so is completely one with the Father. Since he is nothing beside him, claims no special position of his own, confronts the Father with nothing belonging only to him, makes no reservations for what is specifically his own, therefore he is completely equal to the Father. The logic is compelling. If there is nothing in which he is just he, no kind of fenced-off private ground, then he coincides with the Father, is one with him. It is precisely this totality of interplay that the word Son aims at expressing. To John, Son means being from another. Thus, with the word, he defines the being of this man as being from another and for others, as a being that is completely open on both sides, knows no reserved area of the mere I. When it thus becomes clear that the being of Jesus as Christ is a completely open being, a being from and toward, which nowhere clings to itself and nowhere stands on its own, then it is also clear at the same time that this being is pure relation, and is pure relation, pure unity. To John, being a Christian means being like the Son, becoming a son, that is not standing on one's own and in oneself, but living completely open in the from and the toward. That's a lot, but it is gorgeous. So what is marking divine sonship for Ratzinger is exactly this Johannine principle of the being for, a radical openness, a porosity of the Son for us all and for the Father. What it means to be a person, whether human or divine, is therefore to exist in radical transparence, both by and for the other, to allow oneself to enter into an experience of radical communion with God and with each other. This is Augustine again. This is in De Trinitate. When human beings cultivate the theological virtue of love, which is a self-giving and a surrender that does not exhaust or evacuate the self, but rather brings it toward its eventual fulfillment and perfection, human beings not only image, but also truly participate in the Trinitarian nature of God as love. Right? So Augustine will say, he says this in Book 8 of De Trinitate, I want to see the Trinity. Where do I see the Trinity? And Augustine says, if you have seen love, you have seen the Trinity. That's where he starts saying, we love our brother with the love that is God, right? So the Trinity becomes not a sort of speculative doctrine that's way out there and hard to understand. It becomes the most intimate mystery in which we already live and move and have our being, right? That we love with the love that God is. Okay. So for Ratzinger, he goes on and talks a little bit more about this principle of openness, the privileging of the relation of the Son in the hypostases of the divine persons, but he also talks about it in the actual body of Christ, in the corporeality of the incarnate Jesus. We're talking about bodies. We're talking about Christ's body. So he says in the Holy Week meditations that our bodies, our corporeality, is at the same time a bridge to others. It's how we connect to the other. But it's also that which signifies the limit that divides us, right? It closes us off within the barriers of our ego. So our bodies are doing two things at once. It's the bridge and it's the barrier. He says some really interesting things, though, think about John 19, when the blood and water pour out of Christ's side. He draws attention to this outflow of blood and water as opened by the soldier's lance in John's gospel. And this act in Ratzinger's meditation recalls symbolically the open side of Adam in Genesis, from which the rib is taken for Eve's creation. And we see then in Christ the radical relationality and porosity of theological persons. So this is what Ratzinger says about the body of Christ. The limit of the body, the things that separate us from one from another, the limit of the body no longer binds him. As the risen one, he is the open space which calls us all. As the risen one, he is the open space which calls us all. So out of the side of Christ, from this wound in John 19, comes the church, comes the sacraments of baptism, the sacrament of communion, of the Eucharist, right? We have blood and water. This is the site where Christ's body is broken for the many, for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And Ratzinger goes on to say that the open side of the crucified is the point of departure for true human existence. And then he quotes Zechariah. They will look on him whom they have pierced. This allusion to Zechariah in John, the full allusion is, I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of mercy and supplication, so that when they look on him whom they have thrust through, they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and they will grieve for him as one grieves over a firstborn. This allusion to Zechariah in John sharpens the sense that John is offering to us an aesthetic imperative. We must look upon Jesus, the completely open man, in whom the dividing walls of existence are torn down. Christ is entirely transition, a person who knows no firm boundaries, but is essentially openness. on Ratzinger's reading of this prophetic quote from Zechariah, "Herein lies in nuce the full meaning of the Gospel of John. The aesthetic imperative to look on the pierced one," I think is echoed really beautifully in the Good Friday liturgy in the Catholic tradition, wherein it is repeated, "Behold, behold the wood of the cross. Behold, behold the wood of the cross." And also in Pilate's own words from John 19, that same chapter where we see the outpouring of the blood and water, where Pilate says, "Behold the man." For Ratzinger, it's precisely by looking upon the one who has been pierced that we can see beauty itself and the only means by which we can come ultimately to ourselves. So what I want to do now is look explicitly at some of the art of William Congdon to see if we can kind of concretize some of these very dense theological ideas when it gets translated into the language of paint and canvas. Congdon's got a really interesting story. He was an American action painter in the New York school. He was besties with Jackson Pollock for a while. He was part of that same New York school of action painters. But then he became religious in 1959. He converted and got immediately sort of shut out by the artistic community in New York. But when he converted, he ended up moving to a bunch of places. He ultimately landed in Italy, and then he set out on this almost obsessive fixation on painting crucifixes. He painted 180 crucifixes. But what's interesting is when you look at all of these crucifixes together, you can track a declining realism and this kind of steady absenting of the form of the human body from the field of depiction. So what I'm saying is, over the course of time, the crucifixions that Congdon painted became less and less recognizable as a human figure. So this is observable in a couple of ways. I don't have examples of all of these, but first thing is that those crucifixions became really indistinguishable from some of his landscapes. You have a kind of strong horizontal line and a strong vertical line, but it could just as well be, a field from an airplane, right? It's hard to say exactly what it is. And then secondly, the second way that it underwent this constriction of the form is in these nearly formless kind of larval figurations of human suffering. He went to Bombay in the mid-1970s, and he was devastated by the human suffering that he saw in Bombay. He saw people there shorn of their limbs, sitting in the streets. No one was looking at them, right? No, behold, behold the man of the cross, but behold, behold everybody, right? No one was looking at them. And so after that trip, you'll see that his crucifixions became nearly indistinguishable from his Bombay paintings. So I've got one on the screen here. This is 1960, Crucifixio 2, which he painted. And it's recognizable as a cruciform image, right? We can see what it is. But it departs from traditional iconography, mostly insofar as the corpus itself is isolated. Usually in icons of crucifixion, we have more historical figures present there as well. We usually have St. John or Mary, Mother of God, or Mary Magdalene. Here, there are no feet and hands in the frame. This is not a crop picture. This is the whole thing. It is just the strong presence of the intersection of these horizontal and vertical lines. Then a few years later, I think 9 years later, he constricts the frame even further, scraping and cutting the paint with his knife to evoke, but not to represent realistically, the slumped, downcast head of the dead Christ. The figuration of the human form in Christ in this piece is only gestural, although I think it's interesting to me that at the same time it is resolutely physical insofar as you can see the texture of the paint, right? It's asserting the materiality of what it's made with, so there may be something to think about there. So then he goes to Bombay, and this is his Bombay 19 that he painted in 1973. And here he depicted the masses of human suffering that he saw in India. People who had lost limbs, people who were just torsos, and he provides in his notebooks, his kind of commentaries, private commentaries, that he's making a deliberate juxtaposition between the formlessness and the poverty of the human condition. Here, these like little smudges are supposed to be human beings, and the paintings that he makes later of the crucifixions. So this trip really inaugurates Congdon's increasing diminution of the figure of Christ to only a gestural torso. We can see a really clear level of deliberate self-quotation between this and some of the crucifixions that we're about to look at. For Congdon, which I think is resonant with Ratzinger's theological reflections about the corporeality of Christ, the dissolution or the porosity of the figuration of Christ, is not to denigrate the body. I mean, I think there's a temptation there to think that this is disrespectful, this denigrates, and that might be a possible interpretation that we can talk about. But I think what Congdon is after is to demonstrate a kind of radical solidarity with the suffering poor that he saw. So in a 1973 diary entry, Congdon describes this one. This is Crucifix 90 in 1974, right after Bombay, as a flat, squashed, dry lava flow, but trampled as if the traffic of sin had crossed over it for or since all eternity, until the body, what was body, became a stain. It is the road of Bombay. It is the world that continually tramples Christ under. The tar of the road became Christ, who became tar, in order to let himself be flattened until he flowed in the fire of love beyond any boundary. He flows everywhere, and even more in the splinters of the ashes like a bombardment of hate. This image, I think, resonates really beautifully if we can return in a momentary way to Augustine. In his De Doctrina Christiana, he depicts Christ as the one who in his incarnation and passion lays himself down, transforming himself into the very pavement of the road by which sinners can return home. Congdon here prescinds from symbolic or realistic representation in order that those who engage his art can truly see, albeit very hiddenly, the figure of Christ poured out in the Passion as a smudge of tar, a pure nothing, entirely transition. Yet because, and not in spite of this absenting, he is the most beautiful thing there is or has ever been. So since we are in a chapel, I am obliged to confess to you, if I came across one of these paintings in the wild or in a museum, without all this theological setup, even I would not find them beautiful. Even I would not find them compelling. I would be mystified. Compared to the glorious visual and visionary power of something like Fra Angelico or Caravaggio, these paintings pale in comparison. Congdon's smudges are functioning here as limit concepts. So what they can and do offer us is a concrete visual accompaniment of Balthasar and Ratzinger's theological claim that the self-sacrifice of Jesus Christ as the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity illuminates a luminous quality of self-giving love. So to conclude, this final lecture has aimed to suggest, perhaps too provocatively, I don't know, that beauty as defined by classical aesthetics requires a Christian supplement which can account both for the suffering of Christ and for the suffering poor. I've suggested that while Thomas Aquinas' conditions of wholeness, proportionality, and radiance may well persist in Ratzinger's theological aesthetics, they appear under different, altogether counterintuitive signs. Wholeness, the integral, immediately intelligible symbolic form, reveals itself most truly in the utter disillusion of itself, in kenotic formlessness, Philippians 2. Proportion looks like excessive disproportionality, a holy folly or staggering lavishness of the love of a God who would spend God's self fully without remainder. Radiance is obscured under the signs of the lowly, wherein the Alpha is hidden in the Omega, and the suffering Christ, the pierced one, makes himself, in St. Augustine's words, the pavement under our feet along which we could return home. All of these emendations suggest with force the theological virtue of love, by which we love God above all things for his own sake, and our neighbor as ourselves for the love of God. Thank you for your kind attention, and I look forward to our sure to be rich conversation. Thank you.
about 15 minutes for some questions. If we have some questions. Gary?
Did Balthasar believe that humans have almost like hardwired in us a sense of being drawn to the beauty of self-sacrifice in Christ on the cross? Is that something we ever learned, or that we're confronted with that? Does it just draw us in?
The question is does Balthasar have an idea that we are somehow drawn to the self-sacrifice of Christ, or whether that is something that might be learned?
Yes, I mean, he says, remember, like his understanding of beauty is that which contains its own self-evidentiary power, right? And so, yeah, he would say the sort of exposures of the wounded Christ, we see that, and there is something, if we have the eyes to see, there is something that compels us in this sort of deep way, where we realize we see through the form. The form itself looks ugly, but we see the sort of luminosity of the gift, and that's something that we resonate with. And there's other versions of this, like in any movie where the protagonist sacrifices himself or herself, right? I mean, we resonate with that. That happens with people who aren't religious at all, but there's something really touching about that, and that's a storyline that we sort of know. The sacrifice for the greater good, that's all the myths, it's all the fairy tales, it's all of that. I mean, so that I think is part of human, the structures of human knowing and loving, and at least part of the culture at the very least, that we might respond to something like that. Yeah, he uses the language of luminous poverty when he talks about Christ. And we talked about a little bit in the eschatology lecture with that symbol of the Christ, or the little lamb who has been slain from the foundation of the earth in Revelation, I think it's 5. That's a very central image for him for that very reason, right? Because it transfigures what power is. There's a poem, this is not a Balthasar, but there's a poem by, what's his name? Stephen Scobie, called Gospel. I don't think he's even religious at all. I think, but he wrote this kind of like poetic version of the Gospels. And he says, listen, this is all I have to tell you, that love and power are one and the same. Right? And so I think there's something there that we do resonate, that this is like the most powerful act is a self-sacrifice, unless a grain of wheat fall to the earth and die. It's all that.
I had a lot of some questions at the beginning, but about human, what it means to be human, and as you were talking and developing ideas about persona, person, Jesus, and that's the representation of what human. But then I was thinking, why is it that we miss, especially in our this century, 20th century, it wasn't just 20th century, even this century, 2023, we're still struggling with how to be human.
Mm-hmm.
And forget even try to be religious, just to be human.
Yeah.
And so, but then, the response really to me came from that picture. The human is hidden in the way people are traveling, not only in India,
Everywhere.
it takes different forms. Killing Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we learn these? How do we make these great ideas practical in our communities?
Good luck.
If there's a question in there, I think it has something to do with how it is. It's something like a painting like this is a kind of expression of what humanity has maybe brought itself to and how we move through that maybe?
I don't know. I don't have an answer to this question. I am mystified and devastated by this question. Why are we not better at this is another way of asking that question. Right? Why can't we see? That's another thing that I think, just like imagine, like even just sort of like mundane atrocities of walking past someone on the street and ignoring them because you don't know what to say or where to look, right? So behold the wood of the cross, like behold the pierced one. I think this imperative to look and to see is something we're just not very good at. And I think the answer to the question of how to get better at seeing, or how to be better at being people, better at being human, this kind of living open for and toward, it will require like a wholesale revision of all of our cultural assumptions, right? I don't know. I think especially in an American context where you have such a rights-based discourse, this is mine, this is my right, this is my house, this is my money. There are all these kind of ways in which individualism seems to excuse us from the obligation to look and see. But I don't know, I think for me, answers to these kinds of questions are always local and they're always small, right? I think, I don't know like structurally what to do, but I do know how to look at another person. I was sharing with some of the students tonight, one of the things we do in our Great Books program is we take the curriculum to the Center for the Homeless and we read the same books with homeless people as we do with the very elite Notre Dame students who, are just a different demographic. But it's really kind of powerful. I was sharing with the students, we're sitting around the table and you've got these homeless people who are literally carrying around copies of the Norton Anthology with them as they wander around the streets. This is something that's so important. And then, we read Antigone together and we look at, it was a real powerful moment when I looked at this woman and I said, do you think Antigone was right to bury her brother? And she was so touched that someone thought to ask her a question like that and didn't just offer her, a buck or refuse to look at her. Someone cared about what she thought. There's that kind of, John Henry Newman says, heart speaks to heart, right? You can't look at a person as an object, even if you're doing something charitable to them or for them. You can't pull out money and give it to them without looking at them and thinking, you're a person who cares, who has a thought on whether Antigone should have buried her brother. So she felt really seen, I think. And I don't know, I think that's the kind of thing. It has to be local, it has to be small, it has to be in our own kind of ambit. But I don't know how to do that in terms of governance or in terms of a church or in terms of big structures. It's local and small for me, but I don't know. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that. But thank you for the question.
Yes.
Maybe a follow-up to that. What would Pope Francis's theology of encounter? Does that have a connection?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think...
This is really rarefied, and this is really high theology. Get down and wash his feet. Criminals.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you want to repeat that or not, but...
What would Pope Francis's theology of encounter have to do to speak into the way you're articulating local and small.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, right, I mean, it's Francis's kind of practice on Holy Thursday, to wash the feet of people from prisons or other people. So, I mean, certainly in his papacy there are, he talks about the church as, what does he say, a field hospital, right? This is a place where we have to encounter one another as we are, not as we hope to be in our ideal selves, as a place where people are taken care of. And yeah, I mean, the way that Francis does this is by prioritizing those kind of personalist encounters, right? I mean, to see another person, no matter who they are, as a person with dignity. I think, yeah, his papacy has been really good for the kind of general tenor of, Ratzinger was sort of the academic pope, and Francis was, he has a different style, I think, a welcome style, although I love them both. But yeah, I think that's a wonderful model. I mean, the way that Francis talks so plainly also, I think, is a gift to the church.
Yeah.
I'm really afraid to ask this question because it's not So I'm a music minister, and I struggle with parishioners who are really, and this is no news to anybody, who are really stubborn about new music. And they're really stubborn about new styles. And even in my own reading, I come across people like, in David Bethenhardt's Unity of the, he takes every pleasure he can on trashing a lot of forms of contemporary art based on appealing to theological aesthetics. And I was really thinking about that, and I was prompted by two of the things that you were talking about. Number one, Augustine and rightly ordered love, and thinking about the difference between love as instrumental and love as final, and participating in our art or whatever way that we are loving God, if we're loving God intentionally, that kind of love shines back on our reflective love, you know what I mean? And so that was one thing I was thinking about, and I was also thinking about the whole theology of the cross and the gate of the cross and the hiddenness and the Holy Saturday theology that Outlaw had. And that kind of made me reflect on ways that I can think about talking with my parishioners. I mean, obviously that would go way over their heads, but ways that I can sort of first process in this way, talking to my parishioners about why we do some of the things we do and how it reflects the beauty of God, and not just because it doesn't sound like looks or something, but it's beautiful that our worship is in it. So could you just speak a little bit of that? Am I on the right track all over?
Could you speak about how theological aesthetics can help in a specific instance of beauty in its expression of worship, and how to keep people together in the same lane?
This is a tough question. I mean, let me say first that I don't want to suggest that I am advocating for a position simply because we have this idea of the sort of cruciform formlessness, that I am saying, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Everything's just as beautiful as one other thing. It's all relative, man. That's not what I'm saying. I do think, at least in my sort of understanding, there is a kind of resistance, to something that is not like so. Can something like this fall under the ambit of a Christian aesthetic, a Catholic aesthetic? And I think yes. I don't want to say, I want to sort of walk that knife's edge between being a kind of like elitist, sort of like focusing primarily on European art and Western art, and I'm only interested in something that's really technically very good and classically very sort of respectable, right? That's the Mozart, it's all the kind of high art. I think there's There's a lot of joy and a lot of meaning in the lowbrow, actually. But I don't want to suggest that I think there's not a way of adjudicating those kinds of matters. Aesthetics is really complicated, of course, because it is both objective and subjective, right? You have the actual objective feature of the object of beauty, and then you have the sort of subjective reaction that it produces in a person, right? So Aquinas says beauty is that which being seen pleases. Right? That's going to be different for people. So it's hard. I mean, on the one hand, I think there's no accounting for taste, and some people really like kind of old-fashioned hymns, and other people really think they're stodgy and would rather have praise songs or something. So I mean, there's that kind of push and pull. Yeah, please do.
Is that I think what I'm trying to get at when I'm going forward is more that we can let some of the chips fall insofar as style. I want to talk about substance, and if something isn't substantive, I don't want to. I just personally don't want to do it.
Same, yeah.
And if something is substantive and not to someone's taste, I obviously want to pastorally manage how that's administered. But yeah, just I guess for myself, making that call of saying, okay, I think this is substantive. How am I theologically thinking about this in view of the of the theology of the cross, or in view of whatever. So that's kind of what I was driving at.
No, I agree with you on this question of substance. I mean, there's a fascinating kind of, this is not quite what you're asking, but there's a fascinating kind of discussion about kitsch, like religious kitsch, like Thomas Kincaid, that's his name, right? My mother loves Thomas Kincaid. She finds that which being seen pleases. I look at Thomas Kincaid and my heart turns to ice within me. But yeah, I mean, there's, so like in terms of, but I don't want to be the one to say, this isn't good, you shouldn't find meaning in it, right? I mean, she says, I look at this and it's like the fall never happened, and it means something really beautiful to her. I mean, it's like really beautiful. But like, so I'm not responsible for like a congregation. I don't have to be sensitive to like people's taste. But I think it's such a delicate thing in terms of your own ministries, because you are kind of dealing with real people in your community, and you want to not isolate. You want to kind of like give substance, but you don't want to alienate people who, have a history there. I mean, it is a really kind of a tough thing. I don't know. I'm not really answering your question at all, but I don't have a good answer. Yeah.
Well, this has been fun, and we're going to have to cut it off at this particular time. They've been engaging lectures. We're very grateful for your being with us, and I'd like us to express our appreciation for We're going to take a moment to have some prayer for Dr. Martin, and Gary Selby will lead that. And following that, after we dismiss, we have some cookies in the hallway, and we're welcome for a reception and continue conversation.
Everybody stand.
Jenny.
And if our faculty come and gather around her, I asked her if it was okay to lay hands on her, she said that would be all right. So go ahead and gather around her. And I'd like to invite all of you to just, if you would like, to assume a posture of blessing for her, and let you know. We bless God for you, for your many gifts, for a mind that probes deeply into the mysteries of God, for a heart that hungers for the beauty of God, for an open-hearted presence among us, and a voice that speaks truth in a way that is cogent and lucid. And we bless God, and we bless you for sharing your time and insights with us, for being so present with us, for pouring yourself into this brief time, not just in these public lectures, but also in conversations with faculty and with students. You have truly blessed us, and we're grateful. And now we pray that God will give you grace and joy in all the different roles God has called you to, as a teacher, a scholar, a spouse, a mother, a friend, a daughter, as God's beloved child. May you have safe travels and a joyful homecoming, renewed energy and vision for your work, a steady flow of new ideas, and most of all, a deep and abiding knowledge of God's love and care. And finally, for all of us, these words from Ephesians 3. May Christ dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled